Well, welcome everybody. My name's Pat Allman-Road. I'm one of the co-facilitators of the Third Act Lawyers Working Group, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to our program for tonight. Before we get into the thick of that, just a little bit about Third Act and Third Act Lawyers for those few on here who might not already know about it. Third Act is a national volunteer organization started by Bill McKibben to activate and engage those of us who are experienced Americans, that is 60 and over, in the effort to preserve and protect both our fragile climate and our fragile democracy, both of which are under considerable stress right now, as we all know. Third Act is organized in working groups, some of which are location-based. Others are affinity-based. For instance, there is a New York City working group, which I'm a part of. There's a Tennessee working group, which we have at least one member here. There are also affinity-based working groups, like lawyers. There's also a faith working group. There's a labor working group. There's a creatives working group, and several others. So what we're trying to do is provide an on-ramp to just about anybody who would like to join us in this work. And if you're not already a member of either a local or an affinity-based working group, we invite you to check those out on thirdact.org, the website. So tonight, I'm pleased to welcome everybody to the role of business in fixing our troubled democracy. It's a conversation with Daniella Ballou-Aares of the Leadership Now Project. We'll be taking questions in the chat as we go. And Mark Friedman of the Lawyers Working Group is going to be talking with Daniella for a program. So I've got Daniella's biography here someplace, if I can pull that up. Okay. Daniella, as I said, is the founder and CEO of the Leadership Now Project, a national membership organization of business and thought leaders committed to fixing American democracy. Daniella's perspective on the important issues we will be discussing has been shaped by her experience working with leaders in both the business community and government. She began her career at Bain & Company, working across the firm's offices in the US, South Africa, and the UK. From there, she became a founding partner at Dahlberg, where she led the Americas business and transformed the startup into the world's largest social impact strategy firm, with 25 offices worldwide. Daniella also spent 5 years in the Obama administration as the senior advisor for development to the Secretary of State, serving under Secretaries Clinton and Kerry. Daniella's perspectives have been featured in the Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, Fast Company, Politico, and the World Economic Forum, among others. Daniella is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and was a 2014 World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. She holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and an MPA from the Kennedy School. Speaking with Daniella will be Mark Friedman, one of our core team members at Third Act Lawyers. Mark retired from a long career at Intel earlier this year and is currently working as an Encore Fellow at Pro Bono Net. Over its 25-year history, Pro Bono Net has been the country's leading access to justice innovator, creating technology solutions and partnerships that bring free, high-quality legal help to millions of people. So let me spotlight Daniella and Mark and turn it over to both of you.
Hey, thanks, Pat.
There we go.
Thank you so much for joining us, Daniella. Really pleased to have you here. Excited for our discussion. I'd love to hear your insights on this critically important topic. I think we're all painfully aware of the struggles our democracy is going through right now. It's really a frightening challenge that none of us expected to see during the course of our lives. I think it's safe to say. So we're hoping that tonight you can help shed some light on the topic and specifically how the business community really plays a role here. And we'll get into that. We'll get into discussing really, why the business community should care about this, why their role is critical in fixing what's broken and strengthening the system moving forward. We want to understand what Leadership Now's priorities are moving into an election year of next year. And also this group, Third Act, we're people who want to be involved and want to help. So we'd like to understand your perspective on how we can be engaged in your work that involves safeguarding and strengthening our democracy moving forward. So those are the topics. Hopefully, we can leave this with a little bit of hope. It's easy to get super dark about this stuff. I struggle with it every day. It seems like the news is endless, but let's get started. And before we get into the meat of it, I want to just take a few minutes to have your personal story. So Pat gave a summary of your impressive career so far, both the private sector and in the public sector. So can you just tell us a little bit about how your involvement, how the creation of Leadership Now came about, and what led you to the place you are now leading this organization?
Sure. Thanks so much, Mark, and thanks to all of you for being here and taking time for this conversation this afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the country. The overall picture in founding Leadership Now, I had a career where, a lot of it was in the business sector. I had spent time in government, and I kind of started to really, when I moved to New York and I went to Washington to join the Obama administration. It was a fascinating opportunity. It was an interesting role, but I also really felt that I was worried about our institutions. I mean, this was 2012, so it was a decade ago, and it was before the things that we're seeing now, but I did really observe a set of institutions that I felt were challenged in keeping up with kind of the modern world and with the impact of technology and with the changing kind of nature of institutions across the board. And so, I think I kind of was holding that after the 2016 election, and we had clearly kind of a big disruptive moment in our political system, question a lot of, obviously polarization in the system, and Americans overall and people in my network started paying more attention to politics. And I thought it was, so I kind of spent time going back to working with, I spent time with academics that I knew, and kind of really started asking the question of, how did we get here? What were the underpinnings of our system that we're working on? I'm not a lawyer. I studied engineering undergrad and I have a business and policy degree. So I hadn't really had I spent a lot of time with legal scholars and others like Larry Lessig at Harvard, or, across the board. And I really kind of started to appreciate how much our kind of our systems and institutions were at risk, and there had been many risk factors before 2017, but that they were coming to a head in a variety of ways. So I think that but I think the business person in me said, okay, we have all this the analysis, we understand the issues, but there's not the mechanisms to really aggregate the ideas and the action and resources in a way that can have a long-term impact. So obviously that's it's like a big issue. And I started to work on building Leadership Now to take a piece of that picture and say, how do we get the business community and members of the business community to do more than either in their personal context, write a check to a candidate, which is usually the ask, or, have the kind of the other narrow agenda is, chambers of commerce and business associations, which represent business and politics, but don't have this on their agenda and are not necessarily representing our interest as the nexus of being business people and citizens. So that was a big idea, and started building in 2018, and have now grown across the country. And I think we've had some real impact, but there is much, much more to do.
Thank you. Let's start with discussing just that. Why should business care about this? Why is this important? What's really at stake for the American business community in this fight?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the core, and unfortunately, this has become clearer in more recent years that when you really what erosion of democracy ultimately implies is the rule of law being ignored, right? Dissent being crushed, innovation not being allowed, wars become more likely when we don't, like there's the very extreme kind of consequences of democratic erosion, which I would not suggest that we are fully there as a country, although we see things that are worrying, like political retribution. But I think as we have not contemplated typically as Americans, those kind of more extreme consequences. There's something that happens elsewhere, et cetera. But I think we have to be real about where erosion of rule of law goes, right? Where erosion of democracy goes. So I think that's kind of the most extreme consequences, which obviously then mean, economy crashes, markets lost, there's, I mean, whether it's, Russia being the most extreme, one of the most extreme examples we see now, but we see that around the world. But, steps before that, of course, when we see erosion of democracy means things like, you might get legislated against investing how you think it's appropriate to invest. So you can't invest anymore along ESG criteria because that is something that a political leader decided is not, to their liking, right? So it's not an analytical decision. It's, certainly we see the impact. There is a reason why CEOs are getting asked to step in on every issue, because people are feeling in their state that their political system is not responsive. And so it ultimately ends up that, businesses are now trying to solve many issues, whether it's, providing abortion care to your staff, or it's trying to resolve, racial and ethnic differences in a way that we're just not seeing the political system able to handle. So there's a mix of kind of the distraction, the risk of political retribution, and ultimately the risk to innovation and talent that we see. But I think some of the big risks, the bigger ones that I spoke to are ones that we need to kind of, not, we had an insurrection, right? So we can't kind of ignore that those bigger risk factors remain, especially, in for a big power like the US. Right. So like the US just stumbles and the reverberations around the world are very significant.
Absolutely. So the business community, why is their support so critical? When we had an earlier presentation of this group at the end of the summer, we had Mark Elias and Wendy Weiser from the Brennan Center and speaking about democracy. And Mark made a point that really stuck with me, and I think stuck with others on the call, where he talked about historically the role of the business community has been engaged, and he talked specifically about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and how the U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out very strongly in support, and they really, at the end of the day, that community made a big difference in getting that act across the finish line, which was a huge milestone in American history. And then he said, he turned to the audience and he said, like, where are they now? And he was, Mark can get very incensed about these things, and he's very passionate about the topic. God bless him. But he was clearly concerned about this, and it's one of the reasons I reached out to Leadership Now to begin with, and we scheduled this event tonight, is to really understand that intersection better. So maybe if you could give your perspective, sort of a little bit on the history of business involvement in politics, which we can talk about whether this is politics, when politics is a dirty word these days, and immediately you have to choose what side you're on, which is probably not where we want to be, as opposed to democracy, which arguably should be a bipartisan thing that rises above politics. But your perspective on that, the historic sort of role that businesses had, why it's so important at this moment right now to galvanize that community.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think if we look at the current moment, business is Americans have mixed feelings about business. You know, business is extremely, you know, our American business is most respected in the world. We also don't love that, you know, if you look at the polling, we also don't love when business is intervening in politics too much. You know, there's like very mixed feelings. It's like we respect business, we have concerns, et cetera. But all of that said, business is still seen as relatively trusted in a low trust environment, and also as not fully in the political fray. Individual business leaders can be, you know, very respected in their community, depending on who it is, et cetera. So there is an element of like a set of voices that are kind of credible and different than what you're just hearing in the partisan food fight, right? And can be a little bit kind of above the fray. And in a world where there's such lack of trust in so many institutions otherwise. I think, you know, the second thing is the reality is that business is in politics. It's the biggest lobbying dollars, the biggest political dollars, et cetera, on an institutional basis, on an individual basis, come from businesses and business people. And so whether we like that or not, it exists. And so if you're in, I think it's not like business isn't already engaged in the system in various ways. And so if you're in the system, then the obligation and the necessity to use that influence in a way that is helping democracy, not just because you're only because you're doing a good thing, but because it is also self-interested to make democracy work, I think. So I think if you ignore when you look at history, that if business stays on the sidelines, whether it's Nazi Germany or in contemporary Turkey, Hungary, et cetera, many countries that have seen slides to autocracy, the autocrats, you know, there's not enough power to stop autocratic forces often if you don't have business recognizing and playing a part to stop it. So that's like a practical sense that you do need influential actors in society, business and otherwise, to play that role. So, and I mean, Civil Rights Act is certainly a moment, but you see it in lots of, you know, South Africa kind of ending apartheid. I think business leaders ultimately played an important role in ending apartheid without a civil war, and you see it in many other and large places. And when it makes sense, I can share one thing that we see is, you know, we have been kind of involved in many milestones where business has engaged over the last 5 years. And I think the sense that business isn't kind of engaging enough isn't totally, I mean, there's truth in it, but also when you look at a targeted basis in a state, on a particular issue, et cetera, where we think there's most impactful, I think we've seen really good examples of what that engagement would look like. And we need to replicate that, because there is sometimes a sense that like CEOs should talk on every, you know, there's kind of this sense of like every issue is coming to companies. And I think our argument is there are certain issues that are so fundamental and that are specific where it's critical that business stands out, as opposed to kind of generic asks of like speak out in generic ways on a lot of things.
It's just near and dear to my heart. I just retired from a long career with a large corporation, Intel, you know, what I saw there, and I'm curious to get your perspective on this, is you know, at big companies, and maybe this is they have government affairs groups, and the mission of government affairs is typically to help the company achieve its strategic business objectives, and to do so. So interactions with the government primarily revolve around two things. It's how can the government affirmatively support what we're trying to accomplish if that opportunity exists, and B, how do we keep the government from unnecessarily, you know, or regulatory interference? How do we keep them out of our business and keep them from blockading and being in the way of what we want to accomplish? So it's either we want their support or we want them out of the way, and those are all governed by the company's business objectives. And these are companies, they're you know, measured by their shareholders and by how they're, well, these democracy goals we're talking about are big, wide angle issues. They're longer term. So the question for you is, how do you get companies to stop with the sort of you know, move away from this myopic sort of focus on their business, which is reasonable for them to be doing, but also realize that these bigger issues absolutely have to be priority issues for them at the same level, and they can't just hope somebody else deals with this. How do you address that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the challenge that you see on the government affairs side is that, like you said, there's a narrow mandate that many government affairs teams are operating under. And I've seen that typically there's not a lot of oversight of that, right? So that there's a government affairs is saying, okay, I need to write checks to the people on the right committees. And that now means we don't have the big picture of, are those checks going to places that are going to undermine the system as a whole, et cetera, is not part of the question. And I think what we've seen, and part of what we've worked with companies on, is there needs to be a broader framework that boards are using and CEOs are using to say, what's the risk that my company is creating in the system, with our political spending, with our lobbying, et cetera, and not just kind of how do I minimize risk by writing checks to the right places, but how might I be creating risk? And we've worked with University of Michigan, the Urban Institute there has created a set of principles for companies, and we're about to come out with a corporate board guidance that will look at how do, as a board, let's look at all of the political activities of the company and how they could be increasing or reducing risk. So that's a longer term. I mean, it's a big cultural change in government affairs to do that, as I'm sure you know. So I think there's the longer term. There certainly has been advocacy efforts, right, to say, okay, we want companies to stop supporting election objectors. We're going to measure that. We're going to make that a much more robust review of companies. And I think there's a role for that advocacy as well. But in the end, you need internal teams, general counsels, boards to be setting different expectations of government affairs. Because I don't think there's, it's something that's going to have to come a level above in the company from the CEO or the board, typically.
Yeah, but that resonates to me. I mean, after the 2020 election, Intel, along with a number of other companies, many other companies, came out and said that they weren't going to give any PAC donations, any dollars to members of Congress who refused to certify the election. I stood up and cheered. I thought it was great. And then less than 2 years later, I found out we were actually still giving. We started again to give to some of those members, and I was upset about it. I was like, well, why is this happening? I raised it in the meeting. But also I understood that, for Intel, at least, we're trying to get the CHIPS Act passed, which is a huge piece of legislation for the semiconductor industry. It was hugely important for our strategic objectives as a company. And the argument you get from government affairs is like, we can't afford to alienate half of Congress. So yes, we're not going to give to the worst ones, but there's other ones, and I know how you draw a line between some who failed to certify and others, but maybe not everyone's Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz, but hello. So it seems like it's still difficult to get corporations to really understand the business risk, which hopefully that's an area where leadership now is really helping. This is not just something that you're doing because you're getting pressured by advocacy groups or by your shareholders or even by your employees. It's actually good for business and important for business.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe I could put up a few slides. So we create a couple of different products that are an analyses to inform business community about what's the risk looks like, what it implies for them, and also have some case studies of what responses have looked like. So maybe I could put up a few slides and share what that analysis looks like. And we're about to release an updated analysis that you would also find on our website. Just a moment. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, just to kind of give a bit of a snapshot of how we think about the risk factors, what it means for business, and then what does tangible action look like in response. When we look internationally, and I think the starting point for me was really looking at the US from the outside, having spent a lot of my career focused from a foreign policy perspective, from an international business perspective, we see the US declining, right? And it was reclassified by the EIU as a flawed democracy. So we're now slipping behind a lot of other nations. And we do see as well an overall shift in decline among nations between 2010 and 2020. Number of countries declining in terms of their standing on democracy was far higher than those improving.
Declining.
I think someone's unmute. The other thing that we look at, and I think this is really important in terms of thinking about where the opportunities.
European countries.
I think someone, is that better?
Yeah, I'm sorry. If you're not Daniella, please mute yourself.
Great. So if we look at, the thing about democracy in the US is that it also varies significantly by state. So we have a report card that measures state by state, the state of democracy, based on objective third-party data, academic and otherwise. So we look at voting, we look at electoral systems, so the state of gerrymandering, we look at campaign finance laws and give letter grades to every state. And so the states that we prioritize and where our members are most active often are states that have a C or D in democracy. So that's Wisconsin, Ohio, New York, Texas is a D, et cetera. So where those factors of voting rules, electoral systems, and campaign finance are really weak. And I can talk a little bit about what we've done in those states. When we look at political risk in 2024, there's kind of 4 different pieces that we're looking at. We're looking at election risk, so risk to election administration, political retribution risk, so the flavor of what you've seen of Disney, DeSantis and the Florida state government taking on Disney, the kind of gridlock, right? So that we see in Congress, and then increasing pressure on business to engage. So that's, we kind of think about the risk factors that we're facing right now. And there's plenty of, prominent actors that are speaking to how capitalism, how our overall institutional investors, that are saying, look, these are very significant risks to our economy, to our political system. And so we kind of, we look to those actors, we work with them to help them. We have a range of academic advisors and CEOs in our membership that are in the public domain, kind of speaking about that, putting research out that we're able to reference. And, companies are ultimately kind of in this a difficult context in terms of pressure on many sides. Also, I think, Mark, you spoke to the reality is that the ways that many businesses have engaged with government have been extremely narrow, in that it's focused on a tax and regulatory agenda, and they don't really have the existing mechanisms or ways that they're working to support a broader agenda. And we see, but, at the same time, the risk and the opportunities, when you look at polling of companies now, et cetera, they are really seeing, it is fairly extraordinary to see this kind of data in the US, right? That they're worried about, getting punished. 56% of companies, executives interviewed said they're worried about government power being used to reward or punish companies. That is really a very worrying sign, that level of concern. And you can see the other factors here that they're worrying about. So just a couple, I'll give a snapshot. I can go into more. We can go back to the Q&A, but I'll give a snapshot of a couple of places that we've engaged over the last 5 years that I think are, hopeful. First was the 2020 election. I think that's when we were, our first time we were very public, and issued a statement supporting the legitimacy of the election process leading up to the election in October 2020. We had prominent CEOs and executives, not just CEOs, but kind of respected executives like Reid Hoffman or Seth Klarman or others. And we're in the public domain as, we led this statement of our 200 executives. And ironically, a few weeks before the election, when there was the New York Times was saying it's kind of strange that business has to come out and say anything about the legitimacy of the election. Of course, unfortunately, we learned much later. And ultimately, the companies and business associations, which were reticent to come out at that time, ultimately did all come out and condemn, both call for the certification of the election and condemn the insurrection. Another big milestone, if you followed, was the Electoral Count Act, which was passed at the end of 2022, which really cleaned up, to some extent, uncertainty in the presidential transition process that was left over from the way the Electoral Count Act of 1887 was designed. So Paul Tagliabue, the former NFL commissioner, is a member of leadership now. He's also of counsel at Covington. So we've worked now with him and Covington for years around both this type of, engaging in this case on this legislation, but really with a fairly robust set of amicus briefs that we've done now over the years to take on specific instances of whether it's political retribution or, we submitted a amicus brief in the Supreme Court case on the independent state legislature, for those who followed it, which was fortunately unsuccessful in the Supreme Court, but was seeking to make state legislatures free from, the courts and any other check on their power over elections. So this was, we also so this was successful effort where you did get bipartisan legislation on democracy at a federal level, which is a rarity. Another example is our members in Wisconsin, who are very visible in the public domain there, are kind of consistently coming out in favor of democracy. They just came and they ended up asking the gubernatorial candidates to commit to certifying future elections regardless of the result. When one of the candidates didn't do that, they endorsed the other candidate, and they're a very bipartisan group, so they're quite credible as really using democracy as their criteria. They've just submitted an amicus brief in support of the head of the elections there, who there has been attempt to push out without cause. Amicus, the more recently, we have done an amicus brief in Disney, in the Disney DeSantis case, where we've made the case that political retribution is a threat to democracy. It's that in the Disney case, this really was a free speech case, that DeSantis in the state of Florida really sought to undermine Disney's free speech and then exact political retribution as a result, and that's a threat to our economy and markets. That case is still ongoing. So if it goes to the Supreme Court, we'll have a broader coalition of business organizations that we seek to get on board. So just to give you a flavor, I think really the specific state by state work, the specific instances of political retribution is where we see the big opportunities. I'll show you, for anyone who likes Jenny's famous ice cream, or anyone who's had it, Jenny's Splendid Ice Cream, Jenny Britton was prominent in our work in Ohio we had over 50 business leaders come out against an effort to raise the ballot threshold in that state earlier this year, which fortunately failed. The one thing I'll just show you, because I just in thinking about, we can talk more about how people engage, but this is kind of our map for 2024 of where we're seeing opportunities. And in New York, we just got vote by mail passed, which is exciting. But there's going to be court cases. We're going to do an amicus there. There's redistricting in Ohio coming up, election protection and redistricting in Wisconsin. So just knowing that there's a group on the phone here that's across the country, I think when you look state by state, can be more and more tangible opportunities and coalitions of actors, not just us, that are engaged and can create entry points for meaningful impact.
That's great. Thank you for that. Very helpful. I want to turn, before we get to the Q&A, to just looking forward in your priorities as an organization. One of the things that jumped out at me in the slides you just showed was the statement by the conference board and CEOs about top of mind for them is the extremism and retribution. And on one hand, I think in terms of where business can focus, there's taking a stand against the worst, political violence and like against election workers, and making vocal stands in support of democracy and those things. To me, there's another layer of work, which is a deeper layer of work, which is really dealing with the sort of systemic causes of extremism, and that leads to retribution. We wouldn't have retribution happening without extremism, without gerrymandering, without those sort of structural flaws that we're beginning to realize exist with our democracy. And those are tougher issues, but they demand more than performative stances by organizations, by companies. They demand deep thinking and leadership in how to come to systemic solutions to strengthen democracy, not just. I think we're beyond just protecting at this point. We need to, in order to really protect, we have to strengthen, because there's too many ways to game the system. At least that's my perspective. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, redistricting, well, first of all, I mean, I think it's been for a reason that our members are individuals, not companies, right? So we don't take any corporate dollars, et cetera. We're more of a professional organization, right, than a chamber in that regard. And so we have spent a lot of time on first building out the case on what are the underlying issues, gerrymandering, campaign finance, voting rights, et cetera, that are really drivers in the system. And so one, there's an education component that both we do with our members. So, every 2 weeks we have an academic, a expert, et cetera. We go to, our annual meetings are hosted at universities where we're kind of going deeper and building that case and then bringing that into the business press, bringing that into our networks. And then in terms of selecting the issues to work on, we found that having a mix of kind of longer term and shorter term has been the most effective, because there's some very long game things that you can keep kind of chipping away at, but you kind of, it's hard to do that without recognizing there's also things where you kind of need to meet the moment, right, in order to chip away at the long term. So a good example is redistricting, right? So we've, for some time, Ohio is a place where redistricting is definitely a possibility. And so we started a couple of years ago building out in Ohio with members, but there was multiple things that happened in between, right? We had the Electoral Count Act, we had this ballot initiative that was trying to kill a future redistricting ballot initiative, et cetera. So we had engagement from members in those interim places, but 2024 redistricting, where there's a big coalition coming together in Ohio, is, when you're going to get that big shift. So I think and then really the big shift is federal legislation on redistricting, right? Which we also supported. There was the Freedom to Vote Act was a legislation that had redistricting in it at the federal level, which didn't pass, but we supported it. And, we'd like to see it come back, right? We'd like to see. So I think there's the systematic, and then there's things like Final Five voting and open primaries, which we've supported in different states. But one thing I have found is that there's sometimes a risk of like silver bullet, like if we get this one thing to change in the system, it's going to like unlock everything, as opposed to like any of these shifts can be good. In New York, we supported ranked choice voting that passed in New York City, right? That was a good thing, right? It was worth supporting, and it, passed, and we were happy that we had more options in our mayoral election, and that's improved things. Does that solve everything for New York? I promise you not. So if I think the opportunity that we all have is to be, I'm kind of hung up on, historically, you had membership organizations that participated in politics in various ways, right? And you still do. I mean, whether in law, it's the ABA, or you have chambers or otherwise, that we need more modern membership organizations that are having people engage on an ongoing basis and not just on a specific thing. So, and that usually happens at a state or local level, right? So like, what are the issues in your state? Is there an opportunity to do Final Five voting, open primaries, redistricting, change, improve the voting laws, get people elected, some compilation of things. I'm not saying there is not a role for supporting something like redistricting across the country. You absolutely need that as well, but there's many more windows to kind of get involved locally and try to drive some combination of solutions in your city or state, I think.
So just before we get to Q&A, ways that third actors, people in this audience can get involved. I guess your advice is, first of all, start at the local state level and look for those opportunities. But any other thoughts on like ways this community can engage, and then we'll get to the Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, I think we look at 3 different areas, and I can I mean, the slide may or may not be helpful, but I'll share that, you know, look, everyone here has experience, influence, dollars that you can, you know, we think of those 3 buckets, right? And the political system will often, you know, usually you're like asked to write a check for a candidate, or you're asked to do something that's fairly narrow. And we really think about what's the whole range of things that you can do. These are some examples. I mean, they're obviously much more wider range of things beyond what's on this page. But, you know, when we think about influence, we're working with all of our members so they can inform their networks, right? The boards that they're on, the companies, et cetera. You know, on the investment side, you can support candidates, or you can support organizations that are tackling this at a state or local level. And, you know, usually when we think about philanthropic and political dollars, we might be thinking about dollars that go to you know, a cause to address those who don't have enough to eat, or who does healthcare. I mean, any range of philanthropic causes. That all, I think, not to take away from that, but how do you think about supporting the core system as a piece of what you're doing in terms of your philanthropy or investment? And then, you know, I mean, I know, Mark, you're a lawyer. There's a lot of lawyers on this call. We have benefited dramatically from pro bono support from firms like Covington and from individual members of Leadership Now, who are lawyers who have helped us think about what are the right arguments to make in amicus briefs. You know, amicus briefs aren't, you know, obviously the only thing. Also, what legal cases that can be brought, how do you kind of support a local organization that's trying to bring a meaningful case forward? So I think there's many ways to bring the expertise. You know, I think about someone like Paul Tagliabue, who's, you know, in his early 80s, obviously was NFL commissioner, had a posts in a lot of, you know, was on Georgetown board, et cetera, but he really felt that he didn't have a platform where he was able to kind of reach to his networks and engage them on democracy issues. And so that has been a great partnership to have someone like him in our membership who says, look, here's these different assets and networks that I have. I'm really worried about the state of democracy. How do we reach out to those networks to support, whether it's a piece of legislation or a particular legal area? So I think everyone has those pieces of their lives and experience that they can bring to the minimum, educating their networks, and you know, certainly also often to advance a particular issue or legislation or otherwise.
Thanks, Daniella. Pat, let's go to Q&A with the last 15, 20 minutes here.
Okay. I think we have time for folks to actually ask their questions rather than for me to do it. So if you'll hang on just a minute here. The first question we had in the chat was from George Gaines. George, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. So I'm very interested in the effects that social media companies and big tech are having, and they seem like they play a very outsized role. And so I'm wondering, how do you decide how to approach that sector versus, say, a different sector like pharma or something, fossil fuel industry or something like that? Which is anyway, are there different approaches you use, and how do you go about thinking about these different industries?
Yeah, I mean, it's so front and center right now in terms of the disinformation risk with social media and AI, et cetera. What we try to do, because our members are individuals, right, rather than representing the companies, we have a working group of members who are in the tech sector. some of whom are working on, some of the big company election risk efforts. And we have, tried to say, okay, where are the big barriers to progress on this issue, and what are the ways that some of either the companies can be working together? What are the policy solutions? Obviously there's been an effort in Washington to create guidelines on AI, and an executive order on that. So we brought people from the administration together with members of the tech community. But I would not suggest that I have the answer on this. I think there needs to be both the push and pull. I mean, one of our founding members is now Secretary of Commerce in Utah, and she's leading the cases against the social media companies, against Meta, against TikTok. For Utah's cases are grounded in how they have misled parents and children and led to very bad outcomes for children. So, and there's now 40 states that have taken cases against the social media companies. So, I mean, I think this is something there's going to have to be, a push to change behavior. And then there's also going to be work within companies to create better tools, whether it's a Google or a Facebook or otherwise, to screen disinformation. But, I will say that the current state of affairs with disinformation is pretty damning to the social media companies from my perspective, in terms of, and I think, the Israel-Hamas wars is what we are seeing is that, Russia, China, and others are using this context to amplify every piece of divisive content. So I wish I had an answer to right away, but it is going to take some mix of regulation and push from the public. I don't think you're just going to see it within companies.
Thanks, Daniella. The next question is from Penn Hackney. Penn, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Something you said triggered something I looked at on your website, speaking to a misalignment of the corporate policies on ESG versus their actual political spending. One of your research points is that 78% of companies taking direct action toward net zero targets gave more political funding to climate deniers than to environmental support or neutrals in Congress. How on earth do you break through that kind of deep hypocrisy? And that reminds me that just yesterday we learned that at COP 2028, the hosts are actually providing advice and investment in fossil fuel expansion endeavors all around the world while they're hosting this gathering with a catchphrase of decarbonizing faster together. I mean, that's just staggering. That kind of, that's not a misalignment. That's a total psychotic break.
So Daniella, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean,
thank you, Ben.
I don't disagree. I mean, I think we saw in one role that we have played in various contexts is pushing back on the large chambers and at the state level and in Washington in terms of their positions, typically on democracy issues, right? So we have seen, for instance, chambers of commerce in Michigan, and we're trying to prevent this in Ohio, come out in favor of efforts to gerrymander, right? And so we are, our group can be a counter to business associations that are taking the wrong stands on these issues. When the administration put forward Build Back Better legislation, which was the first incarnation of climate legislation, which ultimately, some of it ended up being in the Inflation Reduction Act, but the major business associations worked to kill it. Despite the fact that they had come out in support of climate legislation, and we came out on the other side. I did a piece in Harvard Business Review with Michael Porter, where we said, look, the business or associations have power. they should be using it for the things they said were important, not to kill it. I can't say that we succeeded in getting them to support Build Back Better, but ultimately Inflation Reduction Act passed. So, you know, there is that. All that said, I think the opportunity is that, and it's a little bit to what Mark said, right, is that we have the paradigm of the way business is involved in politics is extremely narrow. And there's two ways to broaden it, either competition. So we kind of provide competition sometimes. We're a different business group with, you know, powerful former current executives, and we can get visibility, and we can push back, and we can put money, et cetera. And we also need changes within the companies where executives who are within the companies say, look, it's not sustainable. It's not possible for us to continue this. So I think you're going to have both sides, but the only way to move it durably is you need policy changes in companies, which is part of why we ourselves, and we work with several partners that are giving much more specific guidance to companies about how to change their practices in this area.
Good luck.
Any of you who formerly worked at companies or on boards, like, you know, I think making them aware of that, and we can share it, like what that guidance looks like, where these issues are. Because I will say, I know CFOs who like didn't even know what their political spend is. CFOs of big companies who don't know what their political spending is.
Yeah.
Right.
But you folks seem to look into that. That 78% stat, for instance, is that data available publicly? Would that be useful to make that available to show which companies are spending what on whom?
Yes,
versus their ESG statements in their whatever their documentation they have.
Yeah, I will put in the chat. It's one of the organizations we reference that has a report card for companies that looks at basically their spending and consistency. I'm just looking for it. Sorry, I'll put it in the chat.
But I mean specifically with company by company name and how much.
Yeah, no, that's what it is.
So that we can try to shame them or try to at least point it out.
I just put it in the chat. It goes company by company and it rates and it looks at the spending. There has been efforts in naming and shaming, and it's not been ineffective. Like, companies have changed behavior, but I think I don't think I think that can continue, but I don't think it's enough. I think you do actually need the practices to change.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, keep at it.
Well, I'm going to claim the host privilege and ask my question. You know, Daniella, I was surprised to find out in, I guess, my second year in law school when I took corporations, just how much of a socialist I turned out to be. You know, when it finally sunk into me that the law says that a corporation is required to maximize shareholder value, I was just floored. I thought, well, what, you mean you can't do anything else? And there are cases after case where it kind of says that. Yes, that's correct. You can't do anything else. So with that as the floor, and I'm exaggerating somewhat, but with that as the floor, how effective can these efforts towards voluntary change, how effective can they really be? Because somebody's going to come along, some shareholder's going to come along and say, well, I think you're minimizing my value or not maximizing my value. So isn't that something we really need to change?
Yeah, I mean, there have been some changes. The rules, the federal government rules that govern pension fund investing have now changed so that you can consider ESG factors. So there's some of those rules changes happening. I mean, there's of course much bigger questions about what does capitalism look like? How do we maximizing that? I don't know that I can opine on fully, but I do think I think there's two different things that it's worth separating, which is the tent for supporting democracy is pretty big from my perspective. And I think that tent can be big enough to make sure that we don't go down a really worrying path. And so I'm interested in making sure that those who want to support democracy are not inadvertently not supporting it. Right. So I do think like there's lots of things in terms of improving the way that our political and economic system are working that I think we need to work on from a policy basis. But I think in the medium term, we can build a pretty strong coalition of individuals and companies that are supportive of democracy. And I would just say, I don't think I think the one big observation for us is that it doesn't have to be companies in a formal sense. A lot of political influence happens through coalitions and individuals, or coalitions of individuals. So you don't always need the companies. You can have executives that are well-respected, pushing on these issues and can be just as influential. If you can't get, it's not that you shouldn't seek to get companies on board, but it's not the only channel.
Quick follow-up on Pat's question, just to go specifically to this issue of shareholder value. It seems to me that, I think it's a very good point, but aren't there arguments that can be made? And I wonder if there's been commentary, research done, just showing that these risks to democracy are actually antithetical to shareholder value, that ultimately, these risks are heading to a place where you're going to be degrading the value of the companies are going to be degraded because the economy is going in, and building that business case for supporting democracy.
And we can
if it
circulate
comes across as benevolence, this isn't going to work, right?
No, I think the case that this influences companies and markets, we've worked with a professor at Princeton who's just done a whole analysis of that kind of lays out the business case, we reference it in our work. There's definitely business cases that have been made, but I do think I've seen the business case for many, many things. For like, diversity is good, you need more women, like we can make the business case, no problem. There is a kind of peer pressure, sensibility, clarity of what you need to do to drive the change that has to be paired with, right? Like the situation we're now is not solved by just a regulation or it's like a culture change. And we need a whole set of people who are kind of talking with their peers and saying like, we have a problem. What are you doing about it? Here's ways to address it. So that's where I think absolutely we should be pursuing, whether it's gerrymandering or redefining the expectations of a corporation and making that clear. Those are all true, but you need people sitting in rooms together also making different decisions.
Well, thank you so much, Daniella, for a very interesting presentation. Thank all of our participants for joining us tonight. I'm glad to have you here. Let me just let you know that we have another webinar coming right up. It's actually next Monday on I think that's December 4th. That's a presentation by Michael Gerard, and oh my goodness, I've forgotten the name of the person who is presenting with him, but we try to alternate between democracy and climate. So the December 4th presentation, the last of this year, is on climate. And I think most of you have probably gotten an invitation to that already, but I'll make sure that you do if you haven't. And we hope you can join us there. But for now, thanks again to Daniella. And thanks, Mark. Did a nice job. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone.
Thanks so much.
Danielle.
Take care.
Bye. Thanks, Pat.